Hello, everyone, and welcome to our time today that we'll be spending together talking about caregiving when life happens to those we love. It was just a short time ago that I became acquainted with a wonderful organization out of San Francisco named CareTribe, and I had a chance to meet their COO and co-founder, Madhavi. And her story was so compelling in sharing this incredible landscape as things sit today. And we wanted to bring that to you from GreenPath and CareTribe because we know that this is an ongoing issue. We know that things are going to continue to, in certain ways, get worse. And so we wanted to spend some time with you today and talk about what is the landscape for caregiving. We have a couple of my colleagues, some dear friends of mine, that experienced some incredible stories of caregiving in their own families. And we thought that there would be some real connection there in sharing that and bringing together the stories and the advice that CareTribe has to offer. Madhavi has some great insights there as well. We're going to talk about the essentials of planning, and then we'll get into Beth's story, and then I'll finish things up with support and taking care of yourself, because that's such a critical piece of caregiving. Wanted to share with you, we have our speakers today. We have Madhavi Vemireddy, our COO and co-founder of CareTribe, Beth Luke and Tina Ponder, who are digital marketer and partner experience manager, and I'm your host, Andy Manthei, business development specialist. So I'll be kind of guiding things through. What I'm hoping for is that this is an open interaction. If you have questions, please use the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner, and that way we can get to those questions. We've allotted some time at the end to really dig into the things that are on your mind surrounding this as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Madhavi.
Thank you, Andy, so much for this opportunity to talk about caregiving, which is even more essential, especially as we are, 9 months into a pandemic. I wanted to talk a little bit about my own story. I have been an active caregiver for the last 10 years for my eldest son, who was premature and had congenital heart disease. And I remember just feeling completely alone in that journey and really struggled, seeing multiple physicians, being in and out of the ICU and trying to do the right thing to help save him. And so I think it's, really important for us to just recognize that caregiving is a universal human experience. And Rosalind Carter, the former First Lady of the United States, who was an active caregiver for her father starting at the age of 12, said it best. She said there are 4 kinds of people in this world. There are those who have been caregivers. There are those who are currently caregiving. There are those who will be caregivers. And there are those who will require caregiving. And so that's really important for us to understand. So even if we are not active caregivers today, it's just to start thinking about how could you plan for future caregiving needs. So with that, let's talk about the growing caregiving crisis that we are experiencing. 1 in 3 Americans today either are caregivers or they need caregiving. And this is only going to grow with the aging population. It's estimated by 2030, so really in the next 10 years, there will be 70 million Americans who are 65 years of age and older. And 70% of them will require some form of caregiving. And the average duration is usually 3.5 years. So that's really a long time to be caregiving, for a loved one. So today there are 53 million of us that are unpaid caregivers. About 9 million are in that sandwich generation, so they're taking care of an older parent and a child. And it's also important to remember that there's caregiving that also happens if you're taking care of a child with special health care needs or if you're taking care of a spouse. So who are caregivers, right? I think we talked about it. It's if you're taking care of a parent or a parent-in-law, spouse or a partner, a child, a relative, or a friend or a neighbor, right? And what's important to understand is that on average, people spend 24 hours a week caregiving. So that is equivalent to a second job. It's a part-time job, and most people are doing it off the side of their desk, and they're struggling. So we go to the next slide, Andy. I think it's, the other thing is you're not alone in this journey if you are actively caregiving. We talked about 53 million Americans being family caregivers. 61% of them are employed, right? And so if you look at any company, there's been, a lot of analysis to say, well, who's caregiving today? One recent survey that Bank of America did showed that almost 50% of employees are caregiving. About half of them self-identify as a caregiver, so they're probably later in the stage of, helping their parents or their spouse or their child, and they recognize themselves as a caregiver. And the other half are helping with a lot of functional activities, but they don't self-identify as caregiving because they're probably earlier in that stage. 61% of caregivers are women, and that's important because women are 20% more likely than male caregivers to actually either cut their hours or leave the workforce altogether in order to continue caregiving for a loved one. Average age is 49 in terms of who is caregiving, but about a quarter of them are millennials. So that's also important to understand. Here are some of the common conditions, right, in terms of who, what type of caregiving situations do caregivers find themselves in. If they're taking care of an older loved one, they might be taking care of someone with Alzheimer's disease or with a chronic health condition like diabetes or cancer, or with a mental health condition like anxiety or depression, or just with general ailments that come with aging, like around mobility and like falls. If you're taking care of a child with special health care needs, the common areas are around asthma, and then attention deficit disorder, developmental delays, behavioral problems, having a child with anxiety or depression, or a child that is on the autism spectrum. So the first question I think is always important, especially if you don't self-identify as a caregiver already, is, are you a caregiver? And here are some of the common things that caregivers do. They help arrange medical appointments. They help with transportation, taking their loved one to the doctor. They help coordinate care, talking to the doctors and the nurses or care managers. They are involved in legal planning or financial planning or paying bills. They do chores around the house. They buy groceries. They're cooking meals. Or they could be helping their loved one with daily activities of care, like getting dressed, going to the bathroom, taking a shower, or taking their medicines. Or you're doing even more complex tasks like giving injections or wound care. And so I think it's first, important to recognize, are you a caregiver or not? And to recognize the challenges that come with caregiving, right? Because usually you're doing it off the side of your desk on top of a full-time or part-time job. B, because you're usually in this journey by yourself, or you feel very much alone in this journey. Caregivers, especially with us going through this pandemic and having so much disruption in our routine and our support system, are feeling the emotional strain, the physical strain, not able to sleep well. They're worried about, how do I keep my family safe so they don't get sick from COVID-19. They're struggling, especially with a lot of us working from home now. How do you, it's not even talking about work-life balance, it's work-life integration. How do these two aspects of our lives come together in addition to the caregiving we might provide. And then I think importantly that we'll talk about is how do you find time to take care of yourself? Because what we typically find is caregivers are always putting the needs of their loved ones first and their needs last. And that results in, a decline in their own physical and mental well-being, which if you're not healthy, you cannot take care of a loved one. And so that's a really important area for us to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one real key thing that we'll jump into now is, as we've unwrapped some of that, is taking a look at an actual story. This happened to Tina, and I think she shares it best. I know as we've talked through some of this, trying to figure out what are the key aspects to bring forward. But Tina, I wondered if you could share with us, what was really the core of what happened and which family member was affected? How quickly did your situation escalate?
So my situation was a very fast escalating one. It was very unexpected. To my mom, I was 29 years old when my mom had a brain aneurysm at age 50. And she's very young, was not expecting this to happen. My mom also has a son who at the time I believe was 12 when this happened, and she did not have anything in writing. She had no will, she had no advance directive, she had nothing written up as far as her wishes, what would happen with the minor child, and she was a single parent. So it was a very interesting time because when my mom had her brain aneurysm, I was living out of state in Texas, and my family lives in Michigan. So that's where my mom and my brother were, my mom's son. So at the time, I kind of had to scramble to figure out, well, gosh, how are we going to get rent paid? She was 1 month behind on rent when this happened, and how do I get this legal stuff taken care of so that I can do what I need to do? Because there was a lot of red tape with that.
Wow. I really appreciate your vulnerability in sharing all of this, Tina. I know that, reliving this can sometimes be, a challenge just, from everything that you went through. What would you say were some of the primary hurdles that you had to climb?
So the first kind of primary hurdle was putting together the financial situation, to be honest with you. We didn't know how long my mom would be, out for. We didn't know at the time she was in a coma, so we didn't know who was going to be taking care of her affairs. So who would be paying her rent, who would be paying her energy bill. I actually wasn't allowed to pay one of her utility bills. The company told me you're not allowed to pay it because the card is not in your mom's name and you're not her. So I wasn't even allowed to pay bills in some cases, which was really interesting, trying to figure out passwords, trying to figure out, okay, well, how could I become mom to, move phone bill around or pay this bill? I had to figure out an attorney. I had to pay money to get an emergency guardianship. And then I also had to do the same for mom's son. And those were both kind of two different processes that cost different money, that had different costs associated with them. And then the other hurdle was we come from a very large Irish Catholic family, and my mom has like 9 siblings. And so at the time, we had a lot of family disagreements about what should happen. And that was the other hurdle that I had to jump through, really, is kind of explaining, I'm a grown-up, my mom's first of kin, that's legally how it works, and having her family members kind of put me through a lot of legal troubles and more money to just make sure that she and my brother were taken care of, because there were disagreements because there was nothing in writing and there was no financial plan. And then the other hurdle, I would say the biggest one, was that when this happened to my mom, she unbeknownst to me, was already a month behind in rent, and she had borrowed money from one of our family friends to pay her previous month's rent. So that was something where we had to come up with, $2,000 quick. So there was a lot of hurdles that went along with that, but those were the primary ones, Andy.
So if you had one piece of advice that you'd pick from all of that to share with the world, what would that be after, going through this whole scenario and everything that happened? What would be that one piece of advice that you hope someone would take away from today?
I would say that a lot of that red tape and a lot of those hurdles could have been avoided had there been something in writing. So no matter how healthy you are, how young you are, you've got to have something in writing. I don't care if you're 21 or 35 or 50, having something in writing is probably the biggest benefit to helping, your caregiver or your children through a situation like this, or your spouse.
Absolutely. Well, Tina, thanks again for sharing that. I hope I know you plan on staying on to answer any questions that any of our group might have. I think the next thing that is a perfect fit here as we go forward is taking a look at some of the planning essentials. So I'm going to turn things back over to Madhavi as she kind of walks us through some of these key planning pieces.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Tina, for sharing your story. As Tina, just highlighted, right, it's how do you plan for the unexpected? Because we would all like to, just kind of go through the normal stages of life, grow old, and, and think that, okay, I don't have to worry about legal planning or financial planning until, I hit a certain age. But the reality is anything can happen at any time, and especially as we are living through a pandemic, that has become the reality for hundreds of thousands of lives today. So let's talk about what the caregiver journey is like. There are 5 stages to caregiving. And again, sort of highlighting, Tina's story, she went from not being a caregiver to jumping right into the sort of mid to later stages of caregiving into growing demand. She just jumped right in, versus some of us that might be, experiencing some of the early stages where we're helping out, a parent or a grandparent with some functional activities like driving them to a doctor's appointment or helping them pick up groceries or medications. And so you're starting to become aware, like, oh, there's, these tasks that I need to do, and make time to do them. And then as you learn more about your loved one's condition, it's understanding, well, how can I best take care of them? What does their insurance cover? What does my insurance or employee benefits cover? And it's really a phase of education, right? So that you can learn to take better care of them. And then as you get into some of the later stages, the demands on you are increasing, right? So you're at higher risk for increasing stress, for burnout. This is where, you tend to not focus on your own care. And this is important because there's been a lot of studies that have shown that, caregivers tend to have higher risk of depression, almost close to 2 times than that of non-caregivers. And related to that also, because they're not following up with a physician for their own health, or they're not, taking care of themselves, they are at higher risk for certain development of chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension. And so, that's important to recognize. And then some of us may, it's unfortunate, but may just find ourselves, if our loved one just received a terminal diagnosis, all of a sudden, which was unexpected, that they're dealing with an end-of-life situation, right? And so, and that's why it's so critical that while we are healthy, while our loved ones can communicate with us, is that we start having the conversation. So let's go to the next slide, Andy, around, what are some of these important what are some of the things that we can do to be better prepared? The first thing that, given that we are, all going through this pandemic, and it highlights even more for us the risk of, of potentially our loved ones getting sick and having to go to the hospital. And, are we prepared for something like that to happen, right? So, the CDC has put out that every household should have an action plan in terms of how they would, handle such an emergency as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So first thing is basic, do you have an emergency contact list, right? Do you know who are the physicians that your loved one is seeing, or even for yourself, right? This is, these are things that we should be doing for ourselves too. So our children or our siblings will know what to do in case of an emergency if we were to get sick. So it's preparing that emergency contact list, knowing, who's currently supporting your loved one, if they have a home care provider, or maybe it's a neighbor that helps out. Getting all of those names on a list with their phone numbers and sharing that with your family members is the first step. And then there's obviously steps around making sure there's food in the house, they're stocked up in case if we have to go, back into shelter in place, or we're in shelter in place, so that, there won't be any concerns around, eating and taking care of themselves. But medications also is a great area. How many of us have a list of the medications that our spouse is taking, or that our parents are taking? Or how many of our family members know if we're taking medications, what they are? So having, again, that list electronically where you can share it and make it available in case of emergency. And then we're going to talk about the conversations you need to have and essential legal documents. So as we talk about conversations, the first thing, especially knowing that we may have a loved one that is at distance from us, that because of travel restrictions, we're not able to visit them as often as we would like. It's just having, regular communications, or identifying, family members, for example, that will be creating that schedule. So they're checking in on an older loved one. How are they feeling? Are they sticking with the routine? Are they eating? Because social isolation and depression is a huge risk right now for older individuals who are isolated in their home or in an institution. It's also understanding, what are your loved ones' wishes? What kind of medical treatment do they want or not want? Who would they identify as making healthcare decisions on their behalf if they're in a place where they can't make those decisions? Same thing. Who would they identify as making the financial decisions if they can't make them? And this is exactly, what Tina was talking about, right? Having these things in writing, having these conversations ahead of time, can avoid a lot of legal costs that may be required if you have to get emergency guardianship, as well as can decrease the disagreements that might happen within a family because your loved one's wishes weren't known and that wasn't communicated to everyone to say, this is what I want. So, God forbid something happens to them, respect my wishes, right? And so that's why it is so important, especially now we're getting into the holiday season. May or may not be able to visit your family members, but even if you can't visit them in person, it's a great way to talk about, this is what I'm, given that we're all going through this pandemic, these are the steps I'm taking to make sure that, my legal and financial, documents are in order. So you guys know what my wishes are in case of an emergency. What are yours, right? That might be a way to kind of lead into that conversation and get things started. And then financially, it's also really understanding, the finances of your loved one. To Tina's point, right? She had to scramble to figure out who do I need to be paying and where's that money coming from? So having, all of that documented is really important. And then if you go to the next slide, these are the 5 essential legal documents that everyone should have. We should have it for ourselves, our parents should have it, our spouse should have it, and so this is, this is really your checklist, right? Does your loved one have an advanced care directive, or otherwise called a living will? That's where they've made known what their wishes are for end-of-life treatment. Do they have a healthcare proxy? So this is the person that's going to make decisions on their behalf medically if they can't make decisions for themselves. Do they have a durable power of attorney? This is the person that's going to make these decisions on their financial matters if they can't make decisions for themselves. And do they have an estate plan or will? So these are the things that you want to ask you want to sort of check for yourself. Do you have all of these in place? And does your loved one know where they are? And you also want to make sure your family members have these documents in place as well.
I really appreciate that, Madhavi. And, as we take a look at this, one of the things that we often see with people that are caregiving is that they don't have the finances available. They don't know what areas they can tap into. They don't know a lot of different things that have to do with the cash flow. How do I deal with growing debt? There's a PricewaterhouseCoopers survey that came out last year that said that people that are caregiving are more likely, I believe it was 2 times as likely to carry credit card debt month to month because they're exhausted, so they're not cooking at home, so they just grab, stuff on the way home. There's a lot of things that are built out of convenience because the person is so exhausted. So, we just thought it might be appropriate at this point to mention that GreenPath can also help in these things as far as the general cash flow analysis, housing counseling things like, maybe if it's a parent, maybe a reverse mortgage they're considering to kind of help pay for some of the care. Does that even make sense? So, doing the reverse mortgage counseling, understanding what their housing options are. Do they sell the house? Do they maybe take out a home equity, those types of things? Maybe they need help with debt management because they've had to put medical bills on credit cards for so long they can't make the payments anymore, and so they need a way to reduce some of those payments through lowered interest rates and things like that. But I think the biggest thing is really the cash flow, and really kind of understanding where am I going to get this money from? Because, as Tina had mentioned, her whole situation was, where do I find this $2,000? Now I've got to pay rent and my rent, and, how do I find the dollars for this? And so really digging into that situation can be really helpful as well. I think at this point, as we take a look at Beth's story, I remember working so closely with Beth as she was going through this. She was directly on my team at the time. And there's just so many things that were happening all at once. So I think it comes best from Beth. So Beth, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you some of the similar questions. What was really the core of what happened and which family member was affected and how quickly did your situation escalate?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So just over 6 years ago, my mother passed away from cancer, and it became immediately apparent that my father was struggling with cognition issues. I had not known that was an issue prior to her passing, and I think that triggered it to advance more quickly. So about 2 weeks after her funeral, he mentioned that he couldn't recall the previous 2 weeks. Little things that he would do or say gave me pause, and, he would call me not knowing how to use the remote or where he parked his car at the mall. And he eventually started disabling things around the house. So he took apart the water softener fairly often. I actually have a high school friend who owns a water treatment company who would reach out to me almost every month, letting me know that he had to make a visit to put it back together. So it progressed from, little things that were kind of easy to brush off to more major ones. It took me about 2 years to get him into a neurologist and have an official diagnosis made, which was at the time mild cognitive decline with a fairly rapid progression. and he was prescribed several medications, but I knew that the outlook probably wasn't very good. And at the time, he was still managing his own finances, so he purchased a cottage and purchased a third vehicle. So the financial impact was something that we had to deal with there. I was a single working mother, and my hands were pretty full with at the time he was 6, with all of his activities, putting in, long hours at work. And unfortunately, circumstances made it unable for him to move into my house or for me to relocate to his. So I did the best I could, as Madhavi had mentioned, helping with groceries, paying bills, organizing medications. I think at one time he was on about 12 different ones at one point, so putting them into a medication box for the week. And keeping up with 3 houses and 4 vehicles. That was pretty consuming. And then about a year after that, I did take him back for evaluation, and he was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's at that time. And that's when I really got serious on evaluating the options. I knew that he was going to need more care than I could provide, so I looked into in-home care options. I think I toured every elder care residence in my area, and it took about a year for me to research to find the thing that would work for both of us the best. And then the placement process alone took about 3 months. So it was time consuming for sure. And then right before he was placed into the facility, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And we chose not to seek treatment, and so he ended up passing about 4 years from when my mother passed. So it was a 4-year journey.
So many things going on, Beth. So much to process. What would you say were some of the primary hurdles that you had to climb, like in the midst of going through all of that?
Yeah, I had a few. I think juggling everything was the most difficult. Looking back, I don't know how I did it, and probably didn't do it very well. And it did take, a large toll, as Madhavi mentioned, on physical and mental health. Also, getting the initial diagnosis was challenging. Getting someone to admit that there might be potentially something wrong and getting into the first doctor's appointment took a lot. Moving him into a facility, ultimately he did end up going without too much difficulty, but I did, receive phone calls every day asking when he could go home. So that was, emotional. And dealing with the financial impact. So the residence cost $10,000 a month. And thankfully my parents had saved and planned for retirement, but I didn't have money to access right away. I didn't have access to it all at once. And so I had to make a lot of financial decisions about selling assets. I took on my own debt to support him and to keep, had to keep up with payments on everything. So the financial impact was pretty big. And then finally, finding reputable, dependable resources. So I did work with a social worker who tried to assist me, but I did spend a lot of time doing my own research, making phone calls. Elder care is expensive, and finding good help and assistance, it took a while. So I think I switched hospice care 3 times in 9 months. So those are the primary hurdles.
So after unpacking all of that, if you had one piece of advice for everyone out there today, what would that piece be? What would you want them to take away from today?
I actually have a couple. Number one is finding support.
Okay.
So I'm very fortunate and grateful to have very supportive friends and family. I would not have made it through without them. There were many late night phone calls and texts. But, ultimately none of them had really been a caregiver before. So I also worked with a therapist after the cancer diagnosis, knowing that he would only have a few months to live, and I continued to see her also after he passed. I was also recommended an elder care attorney, so the documents that Madhavi had just mentioned, they helped me put together. I was able to pull together a picture of all the assets, make sure that I had the will and the trust prepared, having the power of attorney. There's a lot of paperwork involved, and it took over a year after he passed to have things settled then too. So, you know, they're not always the cheapest, but it did save me in the long run. And also taking care of yourself. As Madhavi mentioned, it's very easy for caregivers to put others first, and it can be draining. So, you know, I still have to work on self-care sometimes, but I think that is really the most important advice I would give.
That's so powerful. Well, Beth, thank you so much for your vulnerability and sharing that as well. And my hope is that, you know, as this gets out more and more, that people will be able to see some of those things and take some of those pieces forward. So, Madhavi, what would you recommend as far as the support system? What are some things that you would say going forward as well?
Yes, no, definitely, you know, as Beth noted, you know, having that support system is absolutely crucial as you're going through this journey, because, you know, Beth experienced this for 4 years. That's a long time to, you know, go through sort of the ups and downs of caregiving, and to do it alone will definitely take a significant emotional and physical toll on you. And so that's why, you know, at CareTribe, we really want to help caregivers build their support system. You know, caregivers, they tend to have a hard time asking for help. Maybe sometimes there's sort of guilt associated with that, saying, you know, I should be able to do this on my own. And so that's why, you know, it's really important to ask for help. And typically you will find that your family members or friends want to help, they just don't know how they can help. And so it's really kind of giving them concrete tasks to say, here's, you know, specific ways you can help me, right? And so, you know, it's all about, you know, building that team, or what, you know, tribe is what, you know, we say, you know, it takes a village. So first thing is understanding, you know, who is the backup caregiver? If God forbid, something happens to the primary caregiver, who can you identify within your family or friends that can serve as backup? And this is even more critical now as we are, you know, in a pandemic. It's also making, you know, like I said, it's identifying, you know, really like for your loved one, what are their day-to-day needs, with whether that's with some of their functional activities like transportation, running errands, preparing meals, or that's with their, you know, activities of daily living like dressing and eating and bathing. Like, who is providing that support today? And making sure everyone understands that, so that if something were to happen to any one of those individuals, what is the backup plan? And I think, you know, the more you can communicate, have family meetings on, you know, how things are progressing, or where there might be just, you know, caregiver strain, right? Where someone may need more help because their loved one's condition has progressed, or the needs have progressed, or maybe it's like respite, you know, I don't know, like with, you know, Tina and Beth's experience, how much respite they got. Did they ever get like a few days off to just, you know, decompress? And because if you're doing this years on end, you need to do that, right? And so, you know, identifying maybe it's a family member that can sort of take over some of the day-to-day caregiving responsibilities while you take a few days off. So creating that respite plan is important. And, you know, it's also understanding, you know, Beth mentioned she, you know, worked with a social worker. That's one of the resources that CareTribe provides, is licensed clinical social workers who have expertise in supporting caregivers, whether they're taking care of a older a parent or a relative, or they're taking care of a child with special health care needs, right? The types of resources you may tap into might be a little bit different, but it's understanding what are those local resources that are available to you, because maybe you can have, a transportation service that can do some of the things that you were doing, or arranging for meal delivery so you're not always having to, prepare meals. Like, what are some of those tasks that we can kind of take away from that caregiver and get them the support that they need? And then I do think there is, and we all sort of kind of tend to do this ourselves, is, we're trying to build, a community of finding people that are going through similar journeys. So whether that's, joining a support group, virtual, probably more virtual now than in person, or, it's even within our sort of network of friends and family, like who's gone through the similar experience. When we can find that person or have access to a support group, that just, I can't, I have a group of moms, there's 5 of us that all have a child with special health care needs. And we met each other when our children were like 2 and 3. And to this day, 7 years later, we still, now it's like Zoom meetings, once a month, but we connect. And because we're sharing our experiences, where it can be very stressful at times, but being able to just find joy or laughter and some of the crazy things that we're having to experience as caregivers can just be so healing emotionally for us to know that we're not going through this alone. And there's so many things you learn from others that are going through this. Maybe they found this great resource, or maybe they know this great doctor. And so that's where the power of community sort of comes in. If you go to the next slide, Andy, so this, I want, folks to think about where they can, use an expert social worker to support their day-to-day needs, or I would say more urgent needs, right? So if they're working with or if you're taking care of a loved one and you are beginning to realize that you need more help, whether that's finding a home care provider or you need to start thinking about what are the senior housing options, it is a, pretty daunting to have to do all of this research on your own, the way Beth did, right? And really trying to find, the best provider, the best, facility that will meet your needs and your loved one's needs. So really getting that support to help do some of that research for you and give you options for you to then kind of narrow down that list and help you then decide, what would work best. Helping you find doctors or specialists, helping you get a in-home safety assessment, so that you, especially if you're like in the hospital and you're bringing your loved one home, and let's say they had a stroke or they had a hip fracture, right? You want to make sure that they're coming home to a safe place. So what can you do to make your home safe and ready? And so getting that assessment done is key, because then you can identify, are there other needs like physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy that might be needed? And respite care. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for caregivers to have time off for themselves, with their family or children, to get a break, right? Because you can't do this, without a break for years on end, without not only impacting sort of your own health, but also impacting the care that you provide to your loved one, right? We always talk about that caregiver and care recipient being a functional unit. What impacts one will impact the other. So, our goal is really supporting the needs of both the caregiver and their loved one. And so let's talk a little bit about taking care of yourself, right? I know we have it at the end of the call, but really it's probably the first thing that you want to focus on. Caregiving, as we just talked about, and as you've heard Beth's story and Tina's story, is a stressful journey. And it's even more stressful when you're coming into it and there's been very little done to prepare, for this event, right? Or to prepare on the legal side, financial side, or for advanced care. And you're scrambling to kind of put out the fires and figure things out. And so it's very common for caregivers to just feel overwhelmed, or, have difficulty in sleeping or not eating right, or, experiencing impact to their own sort of emotional well-being, like early signs of depression. Almost 40 to 70% of caregivers have clinically significant signs of depression, right? And we talked about being twice as likely to be depressed compared to non-caregivers. And that's why counseling is so important, right? Working with a licensed clinical social worker, you will, have an expert that is helping you find these resources, put together a plan, but they also can provide that counseling support to that caregiver. And recognizing changes in physical health. So these are the warning signs. If, caregivers are at high risk of burning out, and most caregivers don't ask for help until they've hit that burnout stage. And it's really too late. There's no need for you to get to that stage, right? It's, how do we help you build that support system, get you the support that you need, and help you to remember to prioritize yourself and your needs first, so that you can be the best caregiver for your loved one. So, we talk about having realistic goals, focus on what you can do. You can't do it all, right? Learn to ask for help, getting, support from family, friends, from experts, and then connecting with other caregivers, right? I think, knowing that you're not alone in this journey can have a significant impact on your experience. So, just like how you would schedule time for a meeting or attending this webinar, you have to schedule in the time to take care of yourself. And, even if that means short breaks, 15 minutes, a couple times a day, just to take a walk outside, get some fresh air, that can have a significant impact on your emotional and physical well-being. Practicing mindfulness and breathing exercise. People talk about having, a journal where you're just every evening identifying 3 things that you're grateful for. And so, these are all practices that can help you, can help your emotional well-being and your physical well-being. And, we talked a lot about the challenges of caregiving, especially when it happens to you unexpectedly, especially when you're not prepared for it. But I think it's also important to remember there are rewards to being a caregiver. You typically, gain a much closer relationship to your loved one. You learn new skills. You learn to cope with what life throws at you. It gives you perspective on, what are the things that you should really kind of worry about versus what are the things, day-to-day things that, may happen that, okay, we don't need to stress out as much about that. And it helps us be, more empathetic and compassionate, especially as, we hear other people going through their caregiving journeys and, and really sort of think about how we can help them as they are going through that journey. And I, really thank Beth and Tina for sharing their stories and sharing, sort of their lessons learned, right? So hopefully, that, will help all of us sort of think about, here are some of the things that we should be doing now so that we can be better prepared. And so finally, I just want to let those of you know, if you are actively caregiving or if you want help in planning for future caregiving, you can come to caretribe.com/GreenPath. From there, you can join CareTribe and have access to our licensed clinical social worker. We're making this service free of charge for those of you that have attended this webinar. And, we hope that we can help you start building that support system and help you get better prepared so that your whole family will benefit from that.
Oh, so much great information. Madhavi, thank you. Tina, Beth, thank you. I did want to open up for questions at this point, but I just have to say that, this is something that I've seen so many of my friends and other family members, extended family, start to be impacted. And knowing about all of these things it can make such a difference in our stress levels and just having a plan, to kind of move forward on everything. I did have a couple of questions that popped through. The first one was, it had something to do with the legal documents. So having something in writing, what did that mean specifically? Trust, a will, a power of attorney, or just some kind of signed note or something else? And the second part of that is, and what would have really been helpful for Tina to have in writing that would have made, all the legal issues not be quite so extensive?
Yeah, I'll definitely kick that off, Andy. I mean, it's really important to have, what we call, for example, the proxies, right? The healthcare proxy, the durable power of attorney, guardianship papers, especially if you, have children and trying to identify, who would take care of them in case of if something were to happen to you. So those are formal documents that are important to have in place so that you are identifying, who will be making decisions, whether they're medical decisions or financial decisions for you, if you, if your loved one can't make those decisions. And then advanced care planning or advanced care directive, I should say, or a living will. There are forms that, each state sort of has their own form, but you can download that form and you can start that conversation with your family member and document it, or go to your physician, your family member's provider and and maybe have a further conversation about, what are the different options and what your loved one would want to have versus not have. So, whether that is, we always recommend if you're talking to an elder, if you're doing all of this for your parents or grandparents, see an elder care attorney. We can definitely help you find those resources. So you can find an attorney, near you that has expertise in elder care or has expertise in special needs trusts. But these are there are documents that, you should have done by a lawyer. And, even now, Andy, it surprises me, there are companies that are providing some of these services online and that are much less expensive than actually seeing an attorney. And so there are some of those options as well, but we can help you navigate that and find, what would work best for you.
Excellent. The next question, Madhavi, I have for you. This one had to do with how do I get involved with the food distributions, that type of thing? And as a physician yourself, how does somebody find a good doctor? This person said that the one that they have now doesn't specialize in dementia for her mom.
Yeah, and, that's great. So, a couple things. One of the things we like to better understand is, what resources do you potentially already have access to but may not know it. So if you are an employee right? Your company may have access to certain benefits, like a second opinion benefit, or a concierge type benefit that can help you find physicians within your network or within your parents' network. Likewise, also it's understanding what insurance does your parent have, right? If they have a Medicare Advantage plan, or if they have, just direct Medicare or Medicaid, right? So we'd probably want to understand first what benefits are available to you, and also trying to make sure that we're finding a physician that will be covered, right, by your insurance. But then within that, we can also tap into some of those resources to identify who has expertise in, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, and which is, a big area of concern. Andy, there are almost close to 6 million patients with Alzheimer's disease today, and about 15 million family caregivers for Alzheimer's disease. And one of the challenges with Alzheimer's disease is early diagnosis and early treatment. And most people get diagnosed sort of, later on. And so there could be a lot of value of making sure you're finding the right doctor to, to get evaluated and to be considered, for treatment. And Andy, I think you asked one more thing about food resources.
Yeah, this person had heard the thing about the food truck deliveries to kind of help with getting food there to help you out. And I think they were wondering if you knew of any specific resources that might work there.
Yeah, no, I think, the best thing to do is, join CareTribe, talk to a social worker. Our social worker will identify where whether this is for, you or for your loved one, where they live, and what are some of the meal delivery options that might be local to you. Depending upon sort of income level, some of these resources might be free, free community resources you can tap to, or some of them might be just, things that you would have to pay out of pocket for. But again, another option to kind of lessen the load of meal prep that you might have to be, that you're doing on a daily basis to support a loved one.
Okay. So I've got two more questions. One should be quick, and then the other one might be a little more. The first one is, do you have resources in Spanish?
Yeah, so, currently we have, our site is in English right now. We are having discussions around making our education available in Spanish. But our social workers are able to speak in Spanish, so they can, help provide some of those resources in Spanish.
Outstanding. And this one might be, I know we've got a couple minutes left here, so we've got everyone riveted. How do you talk to your parents about this topic and encourage them to plan for the future if they've not come to terms with their illness and its seriousness?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think, that is the challenge, right? And hence why, typically does not come up. And because, sometimes, family member doesn't want to talk about it, right? And so that's where, I talked about starting with, here's what I am doing. Here's what I am planning. Like, I am really worried about, this pandemic and people getting sick with, all of a sudden. And then if they're in the hospital, like, how do you guys know, like, what legal documents I have or what my wishes are, right? And kind of, starting in with talking about yourself and your own planning and what you've been, doing to sort of, move the needle on that. And then, kind of opening it up to say, like, I think this is an important thing for all of us to talk about. So we all understand, like, what our wishes are, what documents do we have in place, where do we need help getting things going, and even referencing, like, Beth's story, Tina's story, to say, I heard this in one of, a webinar that I attended, and that's really scary. What happened to them and how they found themselves in these situations where they really weren't that prepared to handle. And so, you know, using stories, using yourself as icebreakers to kind of get in, and, you know, at least you may not be able to have this open dialogue the first time, but continue to bring it up and continue to, and again, this is where working with our social workers, understanding your unique family dynamic can kind of help you, give you ideas of how, things to try to kind of break the ice and to get people to talk about it.
Oh, such great information. I did have someone say that they did create all of their legal forms through LegalZoom. So if there is someone who's strapped, I think, Madhavi, that speaks directly to your point earlier about some of those sites that do make it more affordable.
Yes, LegalZoom, Will Trust. Yeah, those are all good sites to go to.
We've gotten such great feedback through all of the chat. So I just want to thank Beth, Tina, and Madhavi for sharing all of this. I think it was eye-opening for a number of people. At least that's what they told me through all of this. And so we do look forward to having the recording and the slides. We're going to get those out to anybody that registered and attended today. And we just thank everyone for their time. We thank you for sharing all of the stories that were here. And again, it's about vulnerability. You know, these things can catch us so off guard. And, you know, on top of all of the to-do stuff, there's all of the grieving, the processing of emotions that we're all having to go through as human beings. And I think that's the thing that I took away in so many ways here today, was finding ways to make sure that emotionally we're okay at the end of the day, and then having these plans and tools and tips and everything that can give us a solid plan moving forward. So I do apologize for taking a little over an hour, but I know we had a lot to cover today. So we look forward to sending out all of that information. If you have additional questions, feel free to visit greenpath.com. Or I will also send in my email address. You can reach out to me specifically. I wish you all the best. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Right.